The town of Shadow Pass was not a place for dreamers. Dust blew through its crooked alleys like ghosts, and judgment lingered in every pair of eyes that watched from behind half-closed shutters. It was a town ruled not by law but by laughter. The cruel kind, the kind that mocked the weak and glorified the loud. Tessa Morgan walked through that town every morning with her chin up and her father's old rifle slung across her back. She didn't smile. She didn't look away. She had learned early on that nothing burned men in Shadow Pass more than a woman who refused to shrink. Her father, Henry Morgan, had once been the town's most celebrated marksman. A legend, they said, the kind of man whose bullet could knock a coin out of the air mid-spin. But legends don't last forever. Elijah was found dead near Black Hollow Creek 5 winters ago, gun missing. Boots stolen and nothing but a whisper left behind. He must have slipped. Tessa never believed that. She never would. Since then she'd kept his memory alive. The only way she knew how, by mastering his craft. Every dawn while the town still slept, she practiced behind the barn shooting at apples, tin cans, and sometimes nothing at all. She didn't shoot to impress. She shot to remember. She shot to survive. The rifle was too long for her arms. It kicked like a mule, but it was the last thing she had of him. And when she held it, the world felt steady. Just for a moment. News of the shooting contest spread fast that year. Sheriff Darrell Monroe announced it with his usual booming voice. Half drunk on stage at the saloon, $50 to the fastest shot in Shadow Pass. Men only unless some gal thinks she can outgun us. Laughter exploded like gunfire. Tessa had already made her decision before the crowd even finished laughing. She would enter. She would stand on that stage. She would win. Miss Wilkes, who ran the bakery and had once held Tessa's hand after her father's funeral, tried to talk her out of it. "You know what they'll say, child," she whispered. "What they'll do if you outshoot them." "I ain't here to be liked," Tessa answered, tying her hair back. "I'm here to be remembered." That night in the privacy of her room, she cleaned the rifle like it was ritual. Each stroke of the cloth a prayer. Each click of the chamber a heartbeat. But something else stirred beneath her determination. A quiet fear she couldn't name. Not fear of losing, not even fear of the men. It was the fear of being seen. Fully, openly. Not as Elijah's daughter. Not as a ghost in a dusty town, but as herself. And in Shadow Pass, being seen could get you killed. The day of the contest arrived like a storm without rain, dry, hot, and heavy with something unsaid. Shadow Pass gathered near the sheriff's post, where makeshift wooden targets had been nailed to barrels and fence posts. The whole town turned out, not for the spectacle of skill but for the sport of humiliation, especially when they saw Tessa May step onto the dirt-packed lot, rifle in hand. She wore her father's old shooting vest, patched and faded, and boots that had seen better years. Her eyes, sharp and unblinking, scanned the crowd. Men jeered before the first shot was even fired. Thought this was a contest, not a tea party. Careful, boys, she might shoot her own foot off. Maybe she's here to marry a bullet. The laughter cut like barbed wire, but Tessa didn't flinch. She walked to the sign-up table and placed her name down with a firm press of the pen. Sheriff Monroe looked up from his whiskey breath and sneered. "You sure, girl?" he asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Ain't no shame in watching from the sidelines." She met his eyes and said plainly, "Ain't no pride in hiding behind rules that fear women." That shut him up, not for long but long enough. She was listed last, right after the town's favorite sons, Jack Tillman, Clint Everett, and Luke the Whip Dawson, whose mustache got more compliments than his aim ever did. Each man strutted to the line, puffed out their chests, and fired shots that split wood and kicked up dust. The crowd cheered wildly, even when a few of them missed, especially when they missed. Then it was Tessa's turn. She stepped forward, adjusted the rifle, took a breath and fired. Crack. The first target snapped clean. Crack. The second clattered to the ground. Crack. The third flew in half. Silence. For a heartbeat, the entire town forgot to breathe. She had outshot all of them by precision, by speed, by control. But silence in Shadow Pass never meant approval. It meant something worse was coming. Clint Everett, red with embarrassment, stepped forward and accidentally kicked one of the spent barrels in her path. Tessa stumbled, caught herself, and raised her rifle again. But the crowd had already started laughing. She got lucky, someone shouted. "Ain't no woman that good unless the devil's in her bullets." Sheriff Monroe walked over with a smirk. "Rules say contestants gotta fire from the same stance." That stumble of yours makes your round invalid. His deputies nodded like trained dogs. You're disqualified. Gasps, then more laughter, but not everyone was laughing. At the edge of the crowd, leaning against a fence post like he'd been carved from it, stood a man in a dusty coat and dark hat. He didn't speak, he didn't smile, he simply watched. His eyes followed Tessa as she lowered the rifle, not in shame, not even in anger. Just disbelief, the kind that hurt worse than pain. As she turned to leave, her shoulders tight and her steps stiff, the man stepped forward. Quietly, deliberately, he reached out, and without a word he took her hand. The laughter still echoed in Tessa May's ears. Even as she turned to walk away, her fingers tightening around the wooden stock of the rifle, she felt it burn against her palm. Not from heat, but from the shame that clung to it like smoke. Her boots scuffed against the dry earth, and each step away from that contest felt heavier than the last. She didn't cry, not here, not in front, them. But her heart was thudding like a second shot she'd never fired. Then from behind her a hand. It came not like a storm but like a shadow. Silent, deliberate, and steady. She turned her head just enough to see him. The man in the long coat. The one who hadn't moved the entire contest. The one everyone avoided like a rumor too dark to name. His gloved hand reached for hers. She didn't understand what was happening until his fingers touched her skin. Not forceful, not tentative. Just certain. He didn't speak, not yet, but his eyes met hers with a calm that stilled the wind and silenced her racing thoughts. There was no pity in his look, no mockery, just a quiet kind of understanding that somehow cut deeper than all the words that had come before. The crowd fell quiet again, not from awe but confusion. Who is that? Someone whispered near the back. Looks like trouble. Is that the one they say killed a marshal down near El Paso? Colt Brennan. Sheriff Monroe muttered under his breath, watching the two figures like a wolf watches fire. Been drifting through the edge of town these past weeks, keeps to himself. Folks say he don't talk unless he's got a reason. And when he does, people tend to stop breathing. But Tessa didn't care about the whispers or the eyes boring into her back. Because the man beside her finally broke his silence. You shoot better than any of them, he said, his voice low and gravel-worn, like it had passed through too many winters. Don't let cowards rewrite your aim. She stared at him. Those were the first kind words she'd heard in months, maybe years, and they weren't said for show. They weren't loud or fancy. They were said only for her, and that mattered more than she could admit. She opened her mouth to reply, but no sound came. He was already turning, still holding her hand as if letting go was not yet an option. The crowd parted for them, not out of respect but fear. Together they walked past the saloon, the general store, the broken church bell that hadn't rung since Tessa's father was buried. They said nothing, but in that silence, something grew between them. A thread, a bond, a possibility. Colt stopped beside the old mill where the wood was warped and the windows shattered, but the light hit just right. He let go of her hand gently, like he was releasing something fragile. You didn't have to do that, she said finally, voice quiet. They'll come after you now too, I know, he answered, then shrugged, as if trouble were a companion he'd long grown used to. She tilted her head. Why? He leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Because I've seen what happens when good hands get broken by bad people. She looked at him, really looked now. He wasn't young, he wasn't clean. His eyes were the kind that had seen too many graves, and his coat hung heavy with stories, untold. There was a scar under his jaw that hadn't healed right, another along the ridge of his knuckles. A man who had lived most of his life on the edge of someone else's trigger. You know how to shoot? She asked, though the answer was clear. He nodded. Then why haven't you entered the contest? I don't shoot for sport, he said. I shoot for silence. She didn't know what that meant, not fully, but it sank into her chest like a cold river. He turned to face her. You ever think of shooting for something other than pride? Like what? She asked. They already stole everything else. He looked at her for a long moment. Not through her, into her. Then shoot for something they can't steal. She stepped back, unsure. Like what? Your story, he said. Shoot so they can't bury your name beside your father's. It hit harder than any insult ever could. She lowered her eyes, swallowed once. I don't know you. You don't need to, but you helped me. He nodded again. Sometimes we don't need reasons, just timing. And with that, Colt Brennan turned and walked toward the horizon, as if he hadn't changed the course of her life with a single gesture. Tessa stood there, rifle in hand, the noise of the contest far behind her, and for the first time in a long while she felt something stir inside. Her chest, Not vengeance. Not even hope. Purpose. The town of Shadow Pass moved on, as towns like that always do. By the following morning, the shooting contest had become just another story. Half true, half invented. Some said Tessa had cried. Others claimed she'd cursed the sheriff and stormed off. But no one could quite explain the man who had walked with her, the one with the silence like thunder and the stare that made grown men blink. No one saw Colt Brennan again for the next 2 days. Tessa May spent those days pacing the edge of her farm, restless. The contest was behind her, but the heat of it still clung to her skin like smoke after a fire. She tried to return to her routines, feeding the hens, hauling water, polishing her father's old bullets, but none of it fit anymore. Something had shifted. She found herself replaying the feel of his hand, the way he looked at her, not like a curiosity, not like a threat, but like something that mattered. She didn't know if it was admiration or simply recognition, maybe both. On the third morning, just as the horizon broke into pale light, she heard the sound. A shot, then another, then silence. It was coming from the ridge behind the old granary. She slung her rifle over her shoulder and climbed the hill, boots slipping in the dry grass. The air smelled of cedar and spent gunpowder. As she crested the ridge, she saw him. Colt Brennan stood alone, shirt sleeves rolled up, revolver drawn. He was shooting at a stump no bigger than a tea saucer, and hitting it dead center, over and over again. His movements were slow, precise, not like a man practicing, like a man remembering. Tessa didn't speak. She watched from behind a tree, her breath caught between questions. Finally he lowered his arm, reloaded, and said without turning, "You gonna keep hiding back there?" She stepped out, cheeks red. "Didn't mean to sneak." "You didn't. I just always know when someone's watching." They stood in silence for a long moment, the kind that stretches without tension. She nodded toward the stump. "You're good." He holstered the revolver. "Used to be better. How come you don't enter contest?" He glanced at her, then at the gun. "Because when I shoot I remember every man I've ever hit, and not all of them deserved it." Tessa swallowed hard. "Your name's Colt, right?" she asked. He nodded. "Colt Brennan, that's what they call me." "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" He took a breath, walked over to a fallen log, and sat down. "Army taught me how to shoot. Life taught me when, and now I try not to." Tessa lowered herself beside him, unsure why she felt safe doing it. Maybe it was the way he never spoke more than necessary. Maybe it was the way he didn't seem surprised by her presence, like he'd already counted her into his day. She turned to him. "They think you're dangerous." He smirked. "They're not wrong, but you helped me." "I did." "Why?" He looked at her, then past her, toward the valley below. "Because I've seen men laugh women into silence, and I've watched those women break because no one stood with them. Not once. I don't do that no more." Tessa let the words sink in. "I want to get better," she said. "I want to shoot clean, not to win contests, but to be someone they can't dismiss." He considered that, then nodded once. "Tomorrow sunrise, bring your rifle." That was it. No promises, no smiles, just an invitation. As she walked back down the hill, heart thudding with something close to gratitude, she realized this man didn't want to save her. He wasn't here to rescue her or sweep her away. He simply saw her, and that was more than any man in Crescent Bridge had ever done. The sky over Shadow Pass had never looked more unforgiving. The following morning, the sun rose pale and thin over the hills, as if reluctant to cast light on a place so full of unspoken wounds. Tessa May stood at the edge of her porch before dawn, clutching her father's rifle to her chest. The metal was cold from the night, but it felt right in her hands. She had barely slept. Her thoughts spun all night, of Colt Brennan, of the contest, of the men who laughed and the silence that followed. She wasn't sure what Colt was offering her. Training, maybe, a kind of mentorship, but it felt like more than that. It felt like someone had cracked open a door that had long been shut, and inside was something she hadn't dared believe in for years. Worth. When she reached the ridge, Colt was already there. He sat on a rock with his revolver in one hand and a flask in the other, his coat folded neatly beside him. The fire hadn't been lit yet. He didn't offer a smile. He just nodded at her rifle. "Show me." She blinked. "Now." He stood, motioned to the post they'd used as a makeshift target the day before. "Let's see what you can do without the noise of a crowd breathing down your neck." She took her stance, feet shoulder width apart. The old rifle rested against her shoulder like a memory. She aimed at the rusted horseshoe nailed to the post and fired. The bullet nicked the edge, not dead center but close. Again, she reloaded, adjusted her grip and fired again. Closer. Again. They stayed like that for an hour. Tessa fired. Colt observed. No praise, no criticism, only subtle nods or small corrections in posture. He moved like someone who didn't waste movement. and expected the same. Eventually, she lowered the rifle, sweat beading on her brow. "You're not much for compliments, are you?" Colt wiped his brow with his sleeve. "Compliments fade. Muscle memory doesn't." She smirked in spite of herself. "You talk like a man who's trained soldiers." "I have." "Which war?" He didn't answer right away. Then finally, "Not one," the government declared. There was a weight in that response. Tessa didn't press. Instead, she sat on the rock where he had been earlier, and glanced at the small fire he finally lit with a matchstick and flint. "Where'd you get all those scars?" He looked down at his forearms, bare now. The sleeves of his shirt rolled up past the elbow. They were a map of pain, burns, cuts, a deep gouge that looked like it hadn't healed properly. "Each one's mistake," he said flatly. "Someone else's, some mine, some theirs, some I can't tell anymore." She traced the edge of her rifle with her thumb. "My father always said a clean shot comes from a clear mind." Colt looked at her, expression unreadable. "Then your father must have never taken a life up close." She flinched. He died near Black Hollow Creek. They said it was an accident." "I don't believe them." Colt was quiet for a long time. Then, "I remember hearing about that." "You were around here then?" "No," he said. "But I've heard stories. Men talk when they think no one's listening." "Do they say who did it?" He shook his head. "Only that he was shot clean. One bullet. No sign of a struggle. Whoever did it was careful." She looked away, the ache in her chest blooming again. "He deserved better." Colt nodded. "Most of the good ones do." They sat in silence after that, watching the fire crackle. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of creosote and dry earth. Finally she asked, "Why help me?" "Really? I don't believe it's just about them laughing." Colt took a sip from the flask, then stared straight ahead. "Because I've seen a woman step into a man's world with nothing but guts and a name, and get destroyed for it. I didn't step in then. I didn't stop it, and I watched her die for it." Tessa's breath caught. He continued, voice lower now. "She was my wife, Leah." The name hung in the air, tender and sharp. "She taught me how to ride, how to track, how to breathe slower when the world felt like it was burning. And one day she walked into a saloon to collect what a man noticed, and she never walked back out." Tessa's hand covered her mouth. "I was 20 minutes late," he said, "and I've been 20 minutes late ever since." She didn't know what to say. There was no comfort to offer, no answer that would soften what he carried. So instead, she did the only thing that felt right. She sat beside him again, close enough that their arms touched, close enough to say, "You're not alone anymore." Colt didn't move away, and in that moment between two broken people with hands full of scars and hearts full of silence, something unspoken was exchanged. Not forgiveness, not love, just recognition. Word spreads fast in towns that run on gossip and liquor. By the week's end, everyone from the saloon girls to the preacher's wife had a new tale to tell. This time about the outlaw training the girl who got laughed off the field. "Colt Brennan's teaching her to shoot," said one man at the barber's. "More like teaching her how to be a widow," replied another. And still another added, "I heard she's sleeping in his shack already. Gun ain't the only thing. He's loading." Tessa May heard the talk. Of course she did. But gossip doesn't kill unless you let it get under the skin. And she'd grown a thicker hide than most. Still, returning to town felt like stepping into a snake pit. Colt rode beside her on the day of the rematch, his hat pulled low, coat bellowing behind him. He said little, just enough to confirm what she already sensed. Today was different. This time she wasn't alone. A storm was coming, and she wasn't afraid of it. The sheriff had no choice but to announce the rematch. Too many had seen the sabotage the week before. Too many had complained, and though he was a proud man, Abner Monroe was also a man who cared about public image. So he called it a retrial, framed as a second-chance exhibition round. No prize, just pride. "Anyone who dares may fire," he declared, "and may the better hand speak for itself." When Tessa stepped forward, the murmurs began again, but this time they weren't all cruel. Some nodded, some even clapped. She saw Mrs. Wilkes near the front, offering the smallest smile. A girl in a green bonnet clutched her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Is she gonna win, Mama?" Colt stood near the edge of the crowd, leaning against the same fence post as before. His arms were crossed, his eyes never left her. Tessa approached the line. Clint Everett, her old tormentor, was already waiting with his rifle, twirling it like a toy. He grinned when he saw her. "Didn't think you'd have the guts to show your face again," he said. She didn't answer, she just took her position. The targets were the same. Barrels with apples, tin cans, iron plates painted white. Wade went first. His shots were sharp, clean. A few cheers broke out. Then it was her turn. She could feel her breath catching in her throat, her heart pounding in her ears. But then, her eyes found Colt still, silent, watching, and she remembered what he said. Shoot so they can't bury your name beside your father's. She took aim, crack. First apple, gone, crack. Tin can split in two, crack. Iron plate, dead center. Each shot brought a gasp, then stunned silence. She reloaded with smooth hands, fired again, then again. Her rhythm was steady, almost musical. Not angry, not showy, just sure. When the last shot echoed across the square, there was no laughter, no jeering, only silence. The sheriff cleared his throat. Well, seems the lady knows her way around a barrel after all. That's when Clint Everett stepped forward again, sneering. Sure, she can hit a few cans, but let's see how she does with a real moving target. He reached down, picked up a glass bottle, and threw it high into the air without warning. Tessa didn't hesitate. She turned, adjusted, fired. The bottle exploded mid-air. The crowd erupted. Even the sheriff couldn't hide the grin curling under his mustache. Looks like Shadow Pass just got itself a new legend. But Tessa didn't smile. Not yet. She turned back toward Colt expecting a nod, maybe a smirk. But instead she saw something different. He was staring at the sheriff, hard, like he'd seen something that didn't fit, something familiar. And then, almost too softly to hear, Colt whispered. He was there. The bottle shards were still falling when Colt Brennan's voice cut through the celebration. Not loud, not dramatic, just a whisper laced with recognition. He was there. Tessa froze. The air around her seemed to tighten. She followed his gaze to the sheriff, who now clapped along with the crowd, pretending amusement. But something in his rhythm was off. Too rehearsed, too clean. Colt wasn't clapping, he was remembering. That night, after the contest had ended, and the crowd had spilled back into their usual rhythms of drink and distraction, Tessa found Colt near the edge of town, where the river bent around the tall grass. He stood with his back to her, staring out at the water. You said he was there, she said, not asking, demanding. Colt didn't turn. The night your father died, I saw him. Tessa stepped closer, her fingers tight around the rifle, straps long across her back. Tell me. He turned to face her then. The look in his eyes wasn't anger. It was something far heavier. Guilt. I was trailing a man out of El Paso. A bounty, dangerous one. Thought I could cut him off through Black Hollow Creek. It was just before dawn. I heard a shot. One clean shot. I got close, but not close enough to stop what came next. What did you see? Her voice cracked. Your father was on the ground, Colt said. Face down. No sign of struggle. Whoever shot him walked away like it was just another morning. Was it the man you were chasing? Colt shook his head. No. I caught up with him the next day, miles from there. But as I was leaving the creek, I saw someone on horseback, heading back toward town. Uniform, badge, glinting in the light. Tessa's breath caught. Sheriff Monroe, she whispered. Colt nodded. He saw me. I saw him. Neither of us said a word. Her legs felt weak.
Why didn't you say anything back then?
I didn't know who your father was, Colt said. Didn't know the town, didn't know you. By the time I returned to Shadow Pass, weeks later they'd already called it an accident. I figured there was no point stirring a pot that was already buried. But now I've seen you, he said simply. And I can't let this lie stand. Tessa sat down on a patch of dry grass. Her hands trembled. Not from fear, but from the sudden clarity that everything she suspected was true. And worse, her father hadn't just died. He had been silenced. Colt knelt beside her. You don't have to do anything. We can leave. We can ride out of here by morning. Start somewhere new. Tessa looked at him. Really looked. This man who had stood beside her when no one else dared. This man who had watched the world break and still stood tall. No, she said, voice steadying. I'm not leaving. Tessa. I've lived in this man's shadow for too long, in my father's name, in this town's mockery, in every damn silence I've swallowed. I won that contest today, not just to prove them wrong, but to prove me right. I deserve to stand here. Colt watched her. A flicker of something like pride passed across his features, but behind it there was something else. Worry. If we go after the sheriff, it won't be clean, he said. I'm not asking for clean. She stood and looked back toward the lights of Shadow Pass, flickering in the distance like a lie that had lived too long. I'm asking for truth. That night, under a sky too dark for stars, Tessa cleaned her father's rifle one last time. But this time, not for sport. This time, it was for justice. And Colt, he sharpened the blade hidden in his boot and strapped on his revolver, wordless as ever, but ready, because when the time came to face the man who took everything from her, Tessa wouldn't stand alone. By morning, the town of Shadow Pass had returned to its quiet lies. The wooden storefronts looked the same. The horses drank from the same troughs, and the people walked with the same judgment in their eyes. But something had shifted beneath it all. Like the first groan of wood before a structure falls, Colt could feel it. So could Tessa. They didn't speak much that morning. They didn't need to. The truth hung between them like a loaded weapon. Sheriff Monroe had murdered Henry Morgan. The only question now was why and how to bring it into the open. We need proof, Tessa said as she packed her rifle. They won't believe it just because you say so. They don't need to believe me, Colt replied. They just need to hear him admit it. How do we get a man like him to confess to something like that? Colt looked toward the sheriff's office, where Monroe stood on the porch, with a toothpick between his teeth, tipping his hat to a passing widow. The same way you win any duel, he said. Pressure, distance, and a clean shot. Later that day, they rode to the southern edge of town, toward an abandoned homestead that once belonged to an old trapper named Millen, long dead and forgotten. Colt had heard whispers in the saloon, something about papers left behind, logs, names, things no one wanted found. The place was caved in and buried beneath dust and ivy, but they found the trapdoor under the stove. The cellar was dry and full of mice, but in the corner, beneath a tin box sealed with rust, they found it. A page, yellowed, torn, a list of names, payments. Deputy A. Monroe, March 5th, $20, deal kept, asset removed. Tessa stared at the note like it was a piece of her father's ghost. They paid him to kill my father, she whispered, because he refused to sell the land. He wanted to build a school for colored children there. He told me that before he died. Colt didn't speak, but something in his jaw shifted. Anger or sorrow, maybe both. Who paid him? She asked. Colt ran his thumb over the smudged ink. Can't tell from this, but it's enough to make the town start asking questions. That night, they didn't return to town. They camped beneath the trees near the old railroad bridge. The fire between them was small, but the silence was heavy. Tessa held the paper in her hands, staring at the handwriting like it might suddenly rewrite itself. He was a good man, she said finally. I know, Colt replied. He believed in things nobody else here cared about. Dignity, books, giving girls a reason to aim higher than marriage. Colt tossed a small branch into the fire. Sparks flew. I remember a man like that, he said. My father. You never told me about him. Colt smiled, thin and tired. Not much to tell. He died before I was old enough to understand what he stood for. But my mother used to say he was the kind of man who could plant a seed in dry earth and make it bloom just by standing near it. Tessa looked over. That's how people talked about my father. Then maybe men like that have a way of finding each other, even in death. A long pause, then Tessa leaned closer to the fire. Her voice was different now, low, resolved. I don't want revenge, she said. I want them to see. I want them to hear him say it. I want them to feel the weight of what they let happen. I want them to know I didn't forget. Colt nodded slowly. Then we'll make him talk. How? He looked at her, not with pity, but with belief. We do what men like him fear most. What's that? We put a woman in front of a crowd and let her speak. The next day, they returned to Shadow Pass with the paper hidden in Tessa's coat. Colt walked into the saloon, whispered in the ear of a man known for spreading stories faster than wind through wheat. By sundown, the whole town had heard the rumor. Tessa May Connolly had found proof her father had been murdered, and that the murderer was still in town. By dusk, the town square filled with faces. Most came for the scandal. Some came for blood, but a few, just a few, came because they remembered Elijah Connolly and the light he tried to bring to a dark place. Sheriff Rick stood on the steps of the church, arms crossed, eyes narrow. What the hell is this circus? He barked. Tessa stepped forward, her coat open, the paper raised. This is your reckoning, she said. The crowd fell silent, and Colt Brennan stood behind her, silent, watchful, and ready to draw. The town square of Shadow Pass had never been so still. Children clung to their mother's skirt. The blacksmith leaned out from his forge, face dark with soot. Even the saloon girls stood on the balcony, their painted smiles forgotten. Everyone watched as Tessa May Connolly, the girl who had been mocked, humiliated and told to stay in her place, held up a piece of paper that carried more weight than a bullet, and behind her stood Colt Brennan, stone-faced, arms crossed, the butt of his revolver just visible beneath his coat. Sheriff Darrell Monroe descended the church steps slowly, each thud of his boots like a warning. "That's some kind of threat, girl," he said, eyes narrowed. "You gonna accuse a lawman in front of all these decent people?" "No," Tessa said, her voice steady. "I'm gonna let you speak. I'm just here to give you the chance to tell the truth." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. She held up the yellowed page. "This is a record, dated March 5th. A payment made to Deputy A. Monroe. It says deal kept, asset removed. That asset was my father, Elijah Connolly." Someone in the crowd gasped. Another whispered, "I told you." Monroe took a step forward. "That's a forgery." "Then why are your hands shaking?" Tessa asked. The sheriff blinked. His fingers twitched, subtle but not invisible. Colt took one step closer, slow and deliberate. "I was there," he said, voice like gravel and thunder. "I saw you riding away from Black Hollow Creek the morning Elijah was killed. You saw me too. But you thought I'd disappear like all the others you scared into silence." Monroe swallowed, the muscle in his jaw jumping. "This is insane," he muttered. "There's no proof." "You are the proof," Tessa said. "You've ruled this town with fear for so long. You forgot what it feels like to be watched, to be judged." She stepped forward, closer now, her voice rising. "My father died trying to build something good. You killed him because it threatened your hold on this rotten town, and now you stand here hiding behind a badge that means nothing." Monroe's hand drifted to his holster. The movement was slow, too slow. Colt's gun was already drawn. "I wouldn't," he said calmly. The sheriff froze. Gasps echoed. The town held its breath. Colt didn't point the gun. He didn't have to. The steel in his voice was sharper than any weapon. "I've killed men for less," he said, "but I'm giving you the choice. Speak the truth, or take your lie to the grave." The silence that followed was unbearable. Then something broke. Not with a bang, but a breath. Sheriff Monroe looked out over the faces of the people he'd controlled for years, and for the first time they weren't afraid. They weren't looking to him for answers. They were listening to her. His shoulders sagged. He licked his lips, and he said, "Yes, I did it." A gasp, then nothing but wind. "I was ordered to," he muttered. The council, some of the men, said Elijah was stirring things up, giving books to colored kids, talking about reform, said he was gonna change everything. They paid me, said it would look like a robbery. One shot, one man, one message. He looked down. It was just supposed to scare people, but he didn't beg. He just looked at me and said, "It won't end with me." And I pulled the trigger anyway. A woman sobbed behind Tessa. "Mrs. Wilkes." Colt holstered his weapon. Tessa's hand trembled, but she held her ground. "You don't deserve a trial," she said. Monroe nodded. "Then do what you came to do." But she didn't move. Instead, she took a slow breath and turned to the crowd. "No, I won't give him an easy end. He's going to live with this. All of you are. You let a killer wear a badge and call it justice." She looked back at Monroe. "Your power is done." He didn't speak again. He just lowered his head and sat on the steps of the church like a man already buried. Colt walked to her side. "You could have pulled that trigger." "I wanted to," she whispered. "But I remembered something." "What?" "That I'm not like him." The crowd began to murmur, this time with something new in their voices. Not disbelief, respect. A woman stepped forward, then a man, then another. They formed a loose circle around Tessa, like petals blooming around a storm-hardened stem. Colt looked down at her, and for the first time since they met, allowed himself the smallest smile. "You didn't need me to save you," he said. "No," she answered, "but I'm glad you walked beside me." By the next morning, Sheriff Abner Monroe was gone. He didn't try to stay and explain himself. He didn't plead for mercy or forgiveness. He simply rode out before dawn, coat flapping behind him, the badge left behind on the church steps like a snake's skin shed in shame. The town didn't chase him. Shadow Pass, so long ruled by silence and smirks, had changed overnight. People looked each other in the eye again. Some muttered apologies. Others simply nodded in Tessa's direction as she passed, acknowledging what had been too long ignored. Truth doesn't always need to shout to be heard. Colt stood by his horse, reins in one hand, saddlebags packed. His coat was dusted from the ride back from the homestead the day before. He looked like a man on the edge of moving on. I suppose this is where you disappear again, Tessa said, arms crossed, voice unreadable. He nodded. That was the plan. She stepped closer. Always running, he shrugged. It's not about running. It's about not breaking things I don't know how to hold. She looked at him. Maybe you just never tried holding something that wanted to stay. A long silence. The wind kicked dust at their boots. A dog barked in the distance. Someone was hammering nails into new wood. The start of something being built. Colt looked down at his hands. Weathered and worn. The same hands that once ended loves. The same that had pulled her from the dirt when the town tried to bury her in shame. You're not who they said you were, she said softly. Neither, are you? He met her eyes. I could stay, he added, voice hoarse. If you asked. She didn't hesitate. I'm not asking, she said. I'm telling you stay. His lip twitched. Almost a smile. Almost. I've got a roof that leaks. A stove that smokes. And chickens that hate strangers, she added. It's not much. It's enough. She held out her hand. The same one he had taken that day at the shooting contest. But this time she was offering it on her own terms. No rescue. No shame. He took it. Her grip was strong. His was steady. Together they walked back toward her home. Past the saloon. Past the store. Past the square where the town had watched her rise from ashes. People watched, but not with mockery. This time, with quiet admiration. At the gate of her father's land, Colt paused and looked out over the dry field. You still want to build that school? He asked. Tessa smiled. I do. He nodded. Then let's build it. And for the first time in years, the ghosts of Shadow Pass began to fade. Not forgotten, but honored. Later that evening, the sun dipped low behind the hills. Inside the farmhouse, her father's rifle rested above the door, polished clean. A symbol, not of violence, but of a name that would never be erased again. As the stars blinked into view, two figures sat on the porch, one who had been mocked, the other feared. But side by side they looked like something rare in a land that forgot how to hope. A new beginning. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones the world tries hardest to silence. But all it takes is one moment of courage, and one person willing to stand beside you. What did this story make you feel? Did you see yourself in Tessa? Or maybe in Colt? Tell us in the comments. Your voice matters here. And if stories like this speak to your heart, subscribe to the channel and join our growing family of people who still believe in justice, kindness, and second chances. Your next favorite story might be the very next one we tell.